so our next presentation will be on the legislative history of this campus, and we're very lucky to have two talented lawyers from the DC headquarters, Robert Davenport and Kristen Strikos. Good morning.
Good morning, everyone. Chairman Beglin, thank you for that introduction. Can you hear me? Okay. When you were talking about the naming rights and mentioned the Office of General Counsel, I think you were using that as an example of a success, maybe. Hopefully that our presentation today will also result in some sort of successes with regards to VCOEB as we move down the line and begin to really understand some of the legislative authorities in which we're operating. As Chairman Beglin mentioned, I'm Robert Davenport. I'm the Chief Counsel for the Office of General Counsel, Real Property Law Group. Our primary responsibility in the Real Property Law Group is everything real property and land use related to the Department of Veterans Affairs. That would be environmental issues, leasing, real estate, and one of the primary projects that falls within that bucket is the West LA project here in Los Angeles. With me today, I have Ms. Kristen Groteclaus, who's one of my colleagues in the Office of General Counsel, and she will be doing a bulk of the presentation. What I would just like to start with is an introduction to the fact that the history of the West LA campus is a long, sordid history that dates back to 1887. You've asked for a laydown of legislative authorities related to the campus. We're not going to go back to 1887, but we are going to provide a general overview that I think will help everyone in this room do their jobs in a more effective manner with regard to this Federal Advisory Commission. One primary point when it comes to legislative authorities is the fact that from a federal agency standpoint, we can only do those things that are specifically authorized by Congress. There are a lot of things, a lot of authorities related to the West LA property that could come into play as part of this development, but the primary legislative authority is really the West LA Leasing Act. We're going to spend the bulk of our time on that, but also make very clear as well that the VA is not authorized in any way to use our build permanent supportive housing. That is typically done through our enhanced use leasing program and partnerships with local and other development entities. So Ms. Groteclaus is going to run through all of that, and we'll be standing by for questions after our presentation. Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. I will try to give a comprehensive overview without boring you with too much legalese. Apologies in advance, and feel free to interrupt with any questions you have, and we'll also have time at the end. As Robert mentioned, I think it's really important to begin with just agency. So generally that takes the form of large agency-wide authorities, but sometimes that can also be more restrictive or limited, as is the case with West LA. So for the West LA campus, it's unique in many regards, not least of which is the West LA Leasing Act. And the West LA Leasing Act is more restrictive than VA's general land use authorities. So basically what that means is VA can only enter into a very limited set of land use agreements on the West LA campus. You can go to the next slide. And the bulk of those land use agreements fall into four main categories. There's enhanced use leases, which are commonly referred to as EULs. Those are authorized under Section 2B1 of the West LA Leasing Act. And under EULs, VA leases underutilized property to third parties who in turn finance, develop, and operate supportive housing on the property for the lease term. That's the only vehicle by which we can develop and operate permanent supportive housing on the West LA campus. The second category is service leases. That's authorized under Section 2B2 of the West LA Leasing Act, and those are leases to third parties to provide enumerated services that are enumerated in the West LA Leasing Act that principally benefit veterans and their families. The third category is easements. Easements are authorized under Section 2E of the West LA Leasing Act, and easements may be granted to public transportation authorities, state, county, or city entities, and public utility companies. And for those of you that might not be familiar with the concept of an easement, it's basically a non-possessory land use right to access someone else's property for a specific purpose. So you can think of, a sidewalk that the city installs on your property, or utility lines, those types of things. And then the fourth category is revocable licenses. Revocable licenses are authorized under a catch-all term in the Leasing Act, Section 2K. And those are when licenses are granted to third parties and they are a revocable, non-recordable right to use VA space or land for a specific purpose. On the West LA campus, the primary purpose must be for the veteran-focused use of the campus. Go to the next slide. And before we get into kind of the nitty-gritty of the legislative history and our current land use authorities, it is helpful to provide a little background to kind of fit these authorities within the larger context of the campus. So unfortunately, Robert, we are going to go back to 1887. The West LA campus was originally donated to the government to serve as a branch of the National Home for Disabled Volunteer Soldiers. In 1887, Congress authorized the establishment of a Pacific branch of the National Home System to be determined property west of the Rocky Mountains. In 1888, Arcadia Bandini de Baker and Senator John P. Jones deeded 300 acres of land to the federal government in what is now West LA and where we're now seated to serve as a Pacific branch of the National Home System. In 1930, Congress merged the National Home System with the Veterans Bureau and the Bureau of Pensions to establish a new Veterans Administration. And that was really the precursor to the modern VA we have today. And then in 1958, Congress enacted legislation that abolished the National Home System, repealed the various acts of Congress that had established the National Home branches, and authorized the VA administrator to provide hospital and domiciliary facilities on any property then owned by the United States. After 1958, the focus of the West LA property and the Veterans Administration as a whole shifted to the provision of healthcare benefits and cemetery services to veterans rather than the construction and management of permanent supportive housing. So that is kind of like a really important shift in kind of the purpose of the VA and the focus of the West LA campus. Go to the next slide. That brings us to some of the specific authorities. The starting point would be 1986. In 1986, the VA administrator notified Congress of his intent to dispose of approximately 109 acres of unimproved land on the West LA campus and 46 acres of unimproved land at another LA area facility, the Sepulveda Medical Center. In direct response to that, the Cranston Amendment was added to the Veterans Benefits Improvement and Healthcare Authorization Act of 1986. And what that did was specifically prohibit the VA administrator from taking any action prior to January 1st, 1988 to dispose of the land described in his notice to Congress. Then following that up in 1988, there was the Veterans Benefits and Services Act, and that enacted a special rule repealing the short-term prohibition provided by the Cranston Amendment and replaced it with a permanent prohibition on disposal of any of the property described in the VA administrator's 1986 notice to Congress. Then the next important piece of legislation to flag is in 1992, the Homeless Veterans Comprehensive Service Programs Act of 1992. In that, Congress granted VA the limited authority to lease land or buildings on the West LA campus to representatives of the homeless to provide services to homeless veterans and the families of such veterans. More specifically, that authorized leases for a term of 3+ years to a state or local government agency or private nonprofit organization, which provides services to the homeless to use the property only as a location for the provision of services to homeless veterans and their families. And then in 2007, we have the Feinstein Amendment to the Consolidated Appropriations Act of 2008. And in that, Congress reiterated and expanded on the previously enacted prohibitions on disposition of the West LA campus by specifically prohibiting VA from taking any action to exchange, trade, auction, transfer, or otherwise dispose of or reduce the acreage of the West LA campus, except to a representative of the homeless as provided in the 1992 legislation. So unlike the 1986 Cranston Amendment and the 1988 Special Rule, both of which only focused on the acreage subject to the VA Administrator's 1986 notice to Congress, the Feinstein Amendment strictly prohibited disposition of any building or land within the entirety of the 388-acre West LA campus. And what's important to note is this also was a prohibition on leasing on the campus, except as authorized in 1992. Go to the next. I'm also going to take a step back and walk through the EUL authority as it applies to the VA. So the EUL authority has had many iterations over the years. I'm only going to highlight the most relevant to our purposes. It was originally authorized in 1991 under the Veterans Benefits Programs Improvement Act of 1991. Congress authorized VA to provide long-term leases to third-party developers to adapt and reuse underutilized buildings or land through a then new type of land use agreement known as an EUL. Because of the 1988 special rule, however, the new EUL authority was not applicable to the areas of the West LA campus and the Sepulveda Medical Center described in the 1986 notice to Congress. As originally enacted, VA's EUL authority was quite broad. It allowed for any use of VA property that was not inconsistent with VA's mission. In 2012, the EUL authority was amended by the Honoring America's Veterans and Caring for Camp Lejeune Families Act of 2012. In that, Congress narrowed VA's EUL authority, authorizing VA to enter into EULs only for the provision of supportive housing. And then again, in 2022, there was an amendment via the PACT Act, the Sergeant First Class Keith Robinson honoring our promise to address Comprehensive Toxics Act of 2022. In that, Congress broadened VA's EUL authority, authorizing EULs that are not inconsistent with the mission of VA and that will enhance the use of the leased property by directly or indirectly benefiting veterans or will provide supportive housing. The PACT Act also increased the term limit for EULs from 75 to 99 years. And then also in the PACT Act, Congress allocated $922 million to enter into enhanced use leases. And $381 million of that is allocated specifically for entering into enhanced use leases on the West LA campus. The broadened PACT Act authority, however, does not apply to the West LA campus because of the West LA Leasing Act, which we'll get into a little bit more on the next slide. So I recommend all of you take the time to read the West LA Leasing Act, as it really lays out a lot of the parameters in which we're limited to operate on the West LA campus and really shapes a lot of our development decisions. The Enhanced Use Lease Authority, as I mentioned previously, is Section 2B1 of the West LA Leasing Act. And it authorizes enhanced use leases for purposes of providing supportive housing that principally benefits veterans and their families. So as you can see, that's a little bit narrower than the PACT Act. And because it's more specific, it limits the authority that would have been granted under the PACT Act that we have elsewhere at the VA. Then also we have our Service Lease Authority, which is authorized under Section 2B2 of the Leasing Act. And that authorizes any lease of real property for a term not to exceed 50 years to a third party to provide services that principally benefit veterans and their families, and that are limited to one or more of the following purposes: the promotion of health and wellness, including nutrition and spiritual wellness, education, vocational training, skills building, or other training related to employment, peer activities, socialization, or physical recreation, assistance with legal issues and federal benefits, volunteerism, family support services, including childcare, transportation, services in support of one or more of the purposes specified in subparagraphs A through H. And then the Leasing Act also specifically authorizes a lease to UCLA. That's authorized under Section 2B3 of the Leasing Act. And that's a lease of real property not to exceed 10 years. And the lease must be consistent with the master plan. And the provision of services to veterans is the predominant focus of the activities during the lease, and that the regions expressly agree to provide during the term of the lease, and to an extent and in a manner that the Secretary considers appropriate, additional services and support that principally benefits veterans and their families, and may consist of activities relating to medical clinics, therapeutic, dietary, rehabilitative, legal, mental, spiritual, etc. So that's long. We don't have to read all of it, but we can move on now. You get the gist of it. It's another service lease authority. Go to the next slide. The Leasing Act also authorizes easements under Section 2E, and it authorizes easements to any local or regional public transportation authority to access, construct, use, operate, maintain, repair, or reconstruct public mass transit facilities, including fixed guideway facilities and transportation centers. That's the authority under which we entered into the Purple Line easement. And then also to the state of California, County of Los Angeles, City of Los Angeles, or any agency or political subdivision thereof, or to any public utility company for the purpose of providing such utilities. And then also the Leasing Act importantly defines principally benefits veterans and their families as that term is used in the act. And it defines principally benefit veterans and their families with respect to services provided by a person or entity under a lease of property or land sharing agreement as meaning services provided exclusively to veterans and their families or that are designed for the particular needs of veterans and their families as opposed to the general public, and any benefit of those services to the general public is distinct from the intended benefit to veterans and their families. It also excludes services in which the only benefit to veterans and their families is the generation of revenue for the Department of Veterans Affairs. And a few other sections worth flagging, though Rob mentioned some of these briefly earlier. Section 2I authorizes the creation of a new federal advisory committee, the VCOEB. And then Section 2J also implements some reporting requirements. It requires the VA to submit annual congressional reports evaluating all leases and land sharing agreements on the campus. And it also requires the IG to report on leases, land use, and draft master plan implementation 2 and 5 years after enactment of the West LA Leasing Act, and thereafter as determined necessary. So basically, the Leasing Act was entered into in 2016. The act required IG audits in 2018 and 2021, and whether there will be additional audits is at the discretion of the Inspector General. Go to the next slide. Since 2016, there have been 2 amendments to the West LA Leasing Act. In 2018, the Department of Veterans Affairs Expiring Authorities Act of 2018 modified Section 2H of the Leasing Act regarding VA's ability to enter into leases or land sharing agreements after an adverse IG finding. The original language was overly broad and prevented VA from entering into any land use agreements after an IG finding. The amended language limited VA's ability to renew or enter into new land use agreements that are subject to an IG finding. So it's a little complicated to understand, but I think it really illustrates what it does by showing the amendment in red here. So you can see as originally drafted, if there was an adverse IG finding on any land use agreement on the campus, we couldn't enter into any new land use agreements. After the amendment, we couldn't enter into new or renew land use agreements that were subject to that IG finding, if that makes sense. Go on to the next slide. And then in 2021, there was another amendment, the West LA Campus Improvement Act of 2021, and that grants VA greater flexibility in the use of land use revenues on the West LA campus. Any land use revenues received by the Secretary shall be credited to the applicable Department Medical Facilities account or minor construction accounts and shall be available without fiscal year limitation and without further appropriation exclusively for any of the following purposes: supporting construction, maintenance, and services at the campus relating to temporary or permanent housing for homeless or at-risk veterans and their families, renovating and maintaining the land and facilities at the campus, carrying out minor construction projects at the campus, and carrying out community operations at the campus that support the development of emergency shelter or supportive housing for homeless or at-risk veterans and their families. And under the original West LA Leasing Act, land use revenues could only be used for renovating and maintaining the land and facilities of the campus. The West LA Campus Improvement Act also defines land use revenue as any funds received by the Secretary under a lease described in Section 2B of the Leasing Act, and also any funds received as proceeds from any assets seized or forfeited and any restitution paid in connection with any third-party land use at the campus. It also extends the term of EULs on the West LA campus to be consistent with the PACT Act, so from 75 to 99 years. One thing that's worth flagging is that the definition of land use revenue does not include easement consideration. And generally, that wouldn't be an issue except for that purple line easement, where I believe the VA received $26.8 million in consideration that we had to remit to Treasury rather than using on the campus. I think that's the gist of the slides I prepared, but we're happy to take any questions or comments.
I'll go first as the lawyer, one of the lawyers in the room, Rob Beglund. And I'll offer a comment. I think this is the first time we've ever gotten a comprehensive history of the legislation, so I'm truly grateful.
Good.
I think we've all tended to look back to the 2016 Leasing Act as the beginning, and you've educated us that a lot of these issues have really been percolating for a long time. So I really just want to emphasize a couple points I took from the presentation. Probably the most important is that as early as 1992, this campus was recognized as a resource for addressing homelessness. We all tend to think about homelessness as a problem that's only gotten public attention in the last 20 years. But Congress actually and the VA were thinking, no, as early as 1992, consistent with the notion this was a veterans home, that we ought to be willing to not only lease, but potentially even sell the land to homeless agencies or actors to address homelessness, which I think is an extraordinary sign. So I just think we all ought to think historically about the fact that this is a long tradition. The other thing is, from the presentation I think is so valuable, is there is this legislation early on about preventing the agency from disposing of this land through private sale. We also, again, tend to think about the Valentini versus Shinseki lawsuit and the concerns about commercialization of this campus as kind of the genesis of where we are and the genesis of the master plan, when in fact that's not the beginning. In other words, even back in the 1990s, people like Dianne Feinstein were worried about the potential for commercialization because of the commercial pressures in West LA. And so they led a charge to set aside this land and preserve it as veteran. So I think it's a great presentation. We've never before gotten it because I think it reminds us that 2015 and the lawsuit isn't the starting point of all this. A lot of these factors go back literally decades. Jim Zenner?
Yeah, Jim Zenner. Yeah, just great presentation. Thank you. Just reflecting on all the thanks that we owe Senator Feinstein for her stewardness of this property. So with the ULI report, wondering, is there any kind of legal issues in implementing the ULI findings based on?
Yes.
I'd love to hear about that.
We haven't fully fleshed out all of their recommendations and the extent to which they're legal. There's definitely a lot of legal interpretation that is required. But for example, things like a hotel, I think all of us can read the legislation and say that likely does not fit within the parameters of a service lease that provides services that principally benefit veterans and their families. Certainly can continue that discussion, but it's a long one.
While we wait for someone else to come up with a question, I do want to spin the idea of that hotel because I don't want us to let go of it just yet. The creation of a veteran-run hotel could be of a vocational training opportunity. So, LA is a tourism economy. There's lots of hotels in the city, the county. And we might want to think about the creation of a veteran-run hotel, which was a totally new suggestion from the Urban Land Institute. I don't think it had ever come up before, as an opportunity to train veterans in hotel work. Be the first to agree with you. It's not conventional. It doesn't fit within the service lease definition real obviously, but we might be able to argue for it under the vocational training.
I think there's a potential where there could be a path towards yes, but I think that it would be very difficult. As we've seen, particularly with the IG's interpretation of many of our authorities. For example, there's a parking lot lease that provides job training to veterans and also the operation of a parking lot which we view as falling within the transportation category of the enumerated categories. And the IG said, no, that doesn't fall within the scope of the West LA Leasing Act, because the fundamental purpose of this lease is to provide parking for the local businesses, not to provide services for veterans, even though it is providing job training for the veterans. So I think we'd fall into that same issue with a hotel. But, you know, we're certainly open to hearing creative arguments and trying to find ways to develop the campus in the best possible way to serve veterans and their families.
Stephanie Coe, please.
Jim, did you have a follow-up though from that? No? Okay. I wanted to sort of piggyback on what Jim and Rob were talking about around the ULA report. I think what we haven't had and what might be helpful, whether it's at a board meeting or a follow-up in between board meetings, because there are not that many in the year, is to really understand from the VA perspective and have a legal analysis on what the intent was for the town center property and sort of where we started many years ago and where we are now, and what is able to be placed there based on what was envisioned in discussions with the community and in discussions with the veteran community during the first set of town halls that we had on the master plan in general. I don't think that, I mean, I think some of us feel like we know the answer, but I'd really like to understand sort of a deeper dive on that question throughout history. The question of, can we put a hotel here? I get that's one part of it, but I think we really need to dive deep into this issue and understand the legal analysis behind it and where the VA sits, so that then we know sort of where we can move forward from here as a board in making future recommendations. Is that something that maybe we could think about?
Absolutely. And I think we'll have to both do an information exchange around the issue and probably also have a focus board meeting. You might even consider a one-day board meeting just on that topic because it's so important. Sarah Hunter.
Oh, just to provide a comment, a creative, discussion around the hotel. I personally think that's a great idea, given the context that this VA serves a very broad geography with the primary medical center being here. If any of you or your family members have experienced a serious health condition, having a hotel nearby for before or after that procedure, and for your caregivers, that could be a really great service. I know UCLA, for example, has sort of a affordable hotel located just a block away from their medical center that provides that support to patients and their families. So something similar like that here on this campus could be a really great asset. And I see that as a service for sure.
Jim Zenner.
Yeah, I just, going back to the hotel, I remember talking about that in 2015 as a community. So that's something we've been talking about for a long time. I think in the most recent USC study, we found they surveyed close to about 3,200 veterans, and they found that 19% of veterans reported being housing unstable in their transition out of the military. And I think a hotel could be a great intermediary to support people transitioning out of the military into Southern California to make sure that they have a place to go. Also, I'm really proud of the conversations we had as a board leading up to the finish of last year around looking at student housing on the campus. I think we got to look outside of course, we have to take care of our veterans that have the most need, but we got to turn the faucet off here in LA and across the country. And I think the hotel is a great piece and part to do that.
Keith Boylan.
Keith Boylan. In San Francisco, they have the Marine Corps Memorial Hotel, which is a 501c3. It's operated since, I think, the 40s. Right around the Union Square area, and it's fabulous. It's a really historic building as well, but it's a fabulous location and opportunity. And it serves any active or any of those who have served honorably have the opportunity to stay at that hotel with their families. And back to Sarah's point, in terms of the proximity to the VA Medical Center, that's also a really really important feature too. So there are examples that currently exist of how this might be done in a way that would be appropriate for the campus.
Let me, just be very clear on the hotel proposal and, the nature of the presentation today. There's no dispute here that a hotel may be a attractive amenity as it relates to the campus. But I think that one thing that we want to make sure that everyone takes away with regards to this presentation is that Congress, in crafting the West LA Leasing Act, was very specific about the types of activities that are permissible on the campus. EUL authority for supportive housing, but then with regard to service leases, a very clearly enumerated list of activities that could take place. Chairman Beglin, I appreciate your thoughts with regard to certain activities, trying to, figure out a way that they can fit within one of those categories. But I think that one other thing that we need to be very clear about, and Kristen did mention this in the presentation, is a question of principally benefiting veterans and their families and how that fits within that enumerated category of uses. So what you're hearing from us is that, from a, not to say that a hotel may not be an attractive amenity as it relates to the campus, but Congress was very clear as far as the types of activities that can be performed on this campus. And, a hotel would, arguably fall squarely outside of those enumerated categories. Okay.
Let me just follow up real quick, Chairman Prerogative. One thing we could do with the hotel concept is make it only eligible for veterans to stay there. So not only would we be framing it as a vocational training opportunity for veterans who are living on campus, but we'd be limiting the audience to veterans and their families. I'd be happy to sit on the floor of Congress and argue that that meets the test of principally benefiting veterans, and I think you would be too. So I just think when people hear the word hotel, I think they reflexively say, oh, that seems awfully commercial. But then I think you have to add, well, maybe it's a hotel that serves just veterans. Or maybe it's a hotel that serves just veterans seeking medical care, long-term medical care at the VA hospital. So I'm convinced we've got enough smart people at the table. We'll figure out a way to finagle the test. Dr. Wellish.
Mark Wellish. The elephant that's still in the room about the West LA VA Leasing Act is the Brentwood School, or not easement, the Brentwood School arrangement. We have, it's a major issue for veterans who want to use this campus and find that that thing exists. And I don't know why it's so untouchable. Why is that?
Well, Dr. Wellish, what I will say is that I think it's very clear that there has been a pretty long record of dispute between the VA's position with regard to the Brentwood School case and the OIG. Our record from a VA standpoint and the Office of General Counsel is that that is a permissible use of the property under the West LA Leasing Act for a variety of reasons, and don't want to get too deeply into that. That's not the primary focus of this conversation, but that is the VA's position with regards to Brentwood schools.
They're in litigation, so they can't go into much discussion. But we'll have a separate information exchange probably on this exact issue. All right, so we're a little bit over time, but I want to respect both Dave's question and John Sharon's. So briefly, gentlemen.
Thank you. Even though this is the first time I'm hearing about the hotel issue, I agree with you that we could treat this, those of us that have been in the military know what military billeting is. And having that for use for just veterans, their families, it respects for tourism. And I also would say that it does fall within the category of supportive housing in the sense that it's temporary in that aspect. So I think there are some ways that it could be included as part of that process, as long as it's utilized specifically for veterans and their families, especially folks that are being treated here at the West LA VA for a variety of reasons.
All right. Dr. Sharon?
Yeah, not to beat the hotel, too much more, but I just want to be clear. I mean, there was a period of at least a year where a number of us were engaging with vets for multiple years to talk about how they wanted to, ideally use this campus for their benefit. The concept of a hotel came up for a lot of the reasons that we're talking about. Being an opportunity for vets who couldn't afford to stay in a hotel here, for veteran families, for people who didn't qualify for what's the name of the place in Patriot House, and there's another one next to it, Patriot House. I haven't been in this game for a while, guys. Anyway, what I think what's happening here is this is a really important opportunity for this entire country to look at how we get government to consider uses of government assets in an entrepreneurial way for the benefit of the people that it's intended. That's the confluence that we're dealing with here, and it's a hot topic. It presses council way over the top. It's been there for a long, long time, but I think we have to use this opportunity to really, really push the envelope on what's possible and recognize that our customer will benefit the more creative we are, the more courageous we are in moving the ball forward in public-private partnership.
All right, thank you very much for the presentation.